welcome everyone to this April webinar of the NZGDA. We've got a very exciting panel of discussion today. We've got some incredible guests from all throughout New Zealand that have successfully secured funding from New Zealand On Air, and we're going to be discussing their stories, their experiences, their advice. And I will just do a quick karakia before we get kicked off into some discussion. And also please know that this is being recorded. We're doing a Q&A at the end, so feel free to throw your questions in the chat and we can get to it at the end. And yeah, we'll get into it. So, tukua te wairua kia reke ki ngā taumata, hai arahi I a tātou mahi, meta tātou whai I naga, tikanga a rātou ma kia mau kia ita, kia kore ai e naro, kia pupuri, kia whakamaua, kia tina, huie, takie. It's a pleasure to have everyone here. All right, so I'd love to start doing a introduction from all of our panelists because they're the value of this chat. So I'd like to just go around and hear from the panelists from their names, their organization, and how NZ On Air has impacted their career or their organizations up until this point. So starting with you, Bradley Walker.
Kia ora, he uru whakahete ki tēnei no te whānau apunui me whakatoia, ko Bradley Walker taku ingoa. I'm Brad Walker, my company is called Adrenaline, and we've been fortunate enough to have 4 games funded by New Zealand On Air. The first game was Tahitu, which is a tile game for younger gamers. Second game was Flying Kiwis, which is a side-scrolling game for a sort of a slightly older audience. Mutorere was a traditional Māori game that we made into an online game as well, with some instructions about how to play against 3 levels of characters. And Mystery Beats is our latest game, and that's a game where we took the characters from our animation series Island of Mystery and allowed people to make their own sounds and own music tracks using those characters and sounds. So that's us. Kia ora.
Thank you, Bradley. Sam, Ramlu.
Good day, everyone. I'm Sam Ramlu from a couple of studios. One is Method, which is a creative tech studio, and we have Mad Carnival, a casual game studio, and Mighty Eyes, a VR studio as well. And our first foray into HEIHEI and NZ On Air funding was with our game Postcards from Aotearoa, which we did in 2020. Well, we got funding for in 2020 and launched in 2021. And then we also launched last year Manu Pinball, which is a really cool pinball game using bird sounds. And this year we are working on Kai Navigator, which is going to launch soon on the HEIHEI platform.
Thank you. And Stef Animal.
Yeah, my name's Stef. I'm from Spooky Soft Games in Dunedin. We've done a couple of HEIHEI games, New Zealand On Air funded games. The first one was Animal Tracks, which was sort of a music production creation game using native animal sounds. And the second one, which was maybe a month from being finished, was called Super Fun Wow Comic Creation Kit, which is sort of a comic creating tool environment thing. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. And Dan Milward.
Kia ora. Dan's the name. I run a studio in Wellington called Game Fruit. We've made 4 games for HEIHEI. A Barefoot Bandits game, platformer, a game called Maya the Brave, a top-down game, and most recently a game called Critters. Another top-down game, and a game called Fanimals, a runner game. Yeah, which we built a couple of years back in the I think it was in the first round of HEIHEI funding, and yeah, they've all had various success or not success, and I'm currently working with NZ On Air as the manager for HEIHEI games, so I'm sort of here to help and answer some questions around funding.
Thank you, Dan. It's really awesome to have you here. And just from my end, I'm acting as host. I'm on my 3rd year of being on the board of the NZGDA, and I love opportunities like this to talk with other game developers. I work as a games producer in the industry, but this is the community side that I love to lean into. And I really love the kind of discourse that's happening that I've noticed in the last couple months with funding programs like New Zealand On Air. And having people like yourself, Dan, to help advocate for our industry is really exciting, just for the opportunities that gives us for how we evolve as an industry, and just the games industry in New Zealand as it's growing to have more opportunities and more opportunities for growth and change. So I think actually if we collectively put all of the projects that have been funded in this panel together, I wonder if that gets close to the $1 million a year that New Zealand On Air has for games that they contribute to, just because of the amount of projects that have been funded here. So that's quite an interesting statistic. So first question that I'd like to ask, and I think this is an interesting one. I've looked into the New Zealand On Air kind of funding requirements. Obviously, HEIHEI being a web platform, and the audience as well being for younger audiences. I'm curious to know how much that has affected the funding process. Was that quite a natural fit for some of your concepts? So, and I'm kind of just opening this up to any of the panelists to jump in, but were there any ideas or any concepts for games that you felt that the New Zealand On Air funding option just kind of fit perfectly with the kind of game that you wanted to create?
I'll talk to this just quickly.
Yeah.
We were already making a children's game, quite a sprawling game with lots of sort of mini games and things. So the New Zealand On Air funding specifically for games for their HEIHEI platform was a really good fit. And also sort of the limitations of having the game run in a browser worked quite well. And we were able to sort of take a small part of the game we were working on and sort of bulk it out, turn it into a fully fledged game in its own right. And it was a really good little opportunity for us to sort of work through an idea, as a separate project, but work through it perhaps more fully than we would have been doing. Yeah,
thanks. That's awesome. Any other panelists with an opinion on that?
I can add something from our side. With our first game, it was in 2020, and so we were kind of at the height of COVID, and we were kind of, when the funding came up, at the time we'd kind of lost as a studio a few projects, council-based projects that had gone because of COVID and lack of funding. And so for us, it was kind of like the projects that we were doing, or things that we were doing, were some of our own internal projects. And essentially what we were trying to do was bring a little bit of joy to the world, because everyone was in this massive state of depression. And so when the HEIHEI funding came about, we thought this could link in really nicely with that kind of, with that ethos. And so at the time, there was we were starting to kind of get back into traveling a little bit around New Zealand, and it was that whole discovering your own backyard. So for us, this idea with Postcards from Aotearoa, which is a game where Auntie Tui is traveling around New Zealand and she sends you a postcard and invites you to join her, but you have to first pack the right gear for where you're going. And so that idea fit really well with what we were doing. And so we applied based on that. So it was a very specific reaction to probably the HEIHEI funding. And then with Manu Pinball, last year, and again with Kai Navigator this year, it's very much been about following that kind of the cultural Kiwi element and a little bit of education along the way as part of it. So, we've kind of kept in that frame and been very specific about the sort of games we want to develop. Going forward, I mean, we're keen to keep doing, games on HEIHEI, and for kids, just absolutely love that space. We're thinking of how we might be able to adapt games that we're now doing, because we have Mad Carnival now and are developing our own IP and family-friendly games. We want to look at how we might be able to take some of those games and adapt them for the, for the HEIHEI platform, or further afield, actually.
Yeah, thanks for that context, Sam. Just interjecting really quick. So we actually have Kelly Davis in the call as well. Lovely to have you here, Kelly. Kelly's the Associate Head of Funding for New Zealand On Air. So what what's great is at the end when we do our Q&A, Kelly can maybe answer some of your questions that you might have about the funding process. And as some of you on the call might know, tomorrow is when the New Zealand On Air funding round opens. So no doubt there's people in this call that are looking at submitting ideas, as well as maybe some of the panelists in here as well. So yeah, if you have any questions, please hold them to the end or just add your comments in the chat. And maybe as we're talking, Kelly can get to them while we're talking. So lovely to have you here, Kelly. Thank you for joining. Next question that I'd like to ask the panel is when it comes to game development, and I think this is no secret, it's incredibly hard to properly scope games. It's just an incredibly complicated medium that incorporates so many different artistic forms, so many different personality types, different departments. So and as a producer myself, I know how important it is to properly budget and scope you know, a roadmap of a game. And my question is, how has the funding that you've received from New Zealand On Air affected your ability to scope? Has it made you have to reduce scope by a lot? Has it been, especially the type of games that you've made, has the scope been quite manageable, or was that a concern at all during the development process when you had these funds, you had this budget for a title that you needed to release? Did anyone have issues throughout development for scope creep or making sure they can deliver what they intended to at first?
Yeah, I'm happy to start on this one. I just want to say that our first game was actually funded through Te Mangai Paho, and it was with Maru Niho, who I saw was on the call here. Thank you, Maru. And that was a game called Mighty Power Wars. So we'd come from that background of creating a game with another game developer who was experienced in that space. So when we first started out, I had someone else, a guy called Stef Animal, work with us, and he had to really sort of think through how we were actually making for web as well. So it was a little bit of a departure from what we'd done before. We'd done an app game before, and so yeah, it was a bit of a challenge just sort of getting that game strategy and structure in the right place, and also working out funds for it, or how we're going to fund it and how we're going to associate that budget was really, really tough going forward, and pretty tough for all 4 games that we've created, so there's not a whole lot of budget there, and you've got to really work hard to make it work. And so in some senses, even though we didn't report this back to New Zealand On Air, we probably put a lot more time and effort into the games to make them better than what was allocated in the budget in the first place. Yeah,
that's definitely a good context to hear for some of those listening. And I'm sure any budget that's given for anything is I doubt you ever get to the end and say that was great. Like it's very hard to perfectly budget, but that's really good to know. Is there any other perspectives from any other panelists that would like to chime in on that?
I'll add a little bit. From tautoko, all of that, basically, we're very much, the same in that sense, but where we also kind of treated the projects were, under our method brand, we do a lot of client-based, service-based work. So with those, we usually get a certain time frame and a budget. And so we were very kind of used to working within what we would call like a campaign style brief. So, a project kind of predetermined, rather than when you're doing your own IP, sometimes you can, that scope's a little bit different. So we kind of treated it very much like one of those, like something that we'd be able to create, develop, and then launch, and it wouldn't necessarily have like a long tail, of support over time. So we treated it like that. And I think like anything we do, and a lot of great developers and creatives do, is you want to perfect that. So you put more effort into it because you want to just get it absolutely right. And so that is something that I think, again, a lot of creatives and developers actually naturally do, and you want to do. And it'd be amazing to have a project. I don't think I've experienced one ever in my 20-something years of this space where you go, you get to the end and go, that was a great budget for that project. So I feel like that comes part and parcel with a lot of what we do as creatives. But at the same time, I think, in general, games do have a certain value that I think isn't always recognized because of the nature of where they're delivered, being online and digital. And so what I'd love to see is, you know, we see all these great games being created for our tamariki. It'd be amazing that we could provide more value for that, you know, and I think place more importance to that. We see it being done in the film side and TV side. It'd be really good to kind of afford that to games as well. So I think what everyone's done here is created like, what we would like to say is probably more shorter plays generally, you know, that we're trying to do to get a sense of, here's a game that we can develop and people can play. What if we were given more? Where could we take this? Another thing to quickly add, and we can probably touch on later, is that for us, it's been a really good testing ground as well for concepts. And, you know, like our pinball game last year that we did, we are developing that out into a fuller game, like a mobile-based game. And so it's been a really great way to kind of test the waters a little bit. And I think you can't underestimate the fact that you have audiences who can play your game and get some of that kind of free testing, I suppose.
Yeah. Thanks, Sam. That was great. I have a question for you, Stef. I know that you do such a great job of representing diversity in your projects and also in your teams. I'd love to know what advice you'd have to other people listening in terms of how to deliver on that diversity flag that New Zealand On Air also require or would like to see more of in their projects. For those listening, I'd love to hear.
Well, I'll start by saying I don't totally agree that's something we do a great job of. I think, as far as I'm aware, and maybe my team are going to kill me, but we're all pretty much Pākehā. But you know, there are a lot of women that we work with, queer people. You know, we had our last HEIHEI game translated to Te Reo, but I suppose from that viewpoint, I'd just say probably make games with people that are going to have interesting, good ideas that come from a good place, I guess, who you might also have a sympathy with. Yeah, I guess, yeah, seek people out who are different from you and are going to, I think the best feeling for me is you know, having a team that's kind of greater than the sum of its parts, I suppose. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind adding a little bit to that, Carl, and that, you know, I think a lot of what I've seen in the HEIHEI games coming through is just this natural sense of Kiwiness, if that's a word I can use, you know, like you recognize that there's elements of there that are very much linked to Aotearoa and growing up here and the culture. And I guess that's what's really beautiful about it, is that it's something that Kiwi kids can actually really relate to, but they're also great games in their own sense. So I think that's one thing to remember, is that, you know, sometimes I think, and even we've done that a little bit, you know, with postcards from Aotearoa maybe was almost a little bit too educational at times. And so how you make sure that you can make gamified a lot more, because at the end of the day, kids are coming in there to play games. One of the things we've done in terms of making sure that we've got diverse content and, you know, thought of mind is through the team that we work with and the different people. I've got a son who's been in the right age range, is coming out of it soon, which is very sad for me. But him and his friends get a lot of basically get hassled from me to, you know, test our games a lot. And I think that is just, that adds so much value to the games that you actually have kids testing it regularly as you're developing. And then also, like for us, we've had a couple of cultural advisors, you know, come on board, friends or, you know, advisors who've actually helped with create, you know, additional elements to the game. Postcards from Aotearoa, you know, put it past someone who we were working with at the time, who looked at it as a Māori consultant and kind of said, wouldn't it be great if you had the te reo words for some of these items, you know, in the dress up kind of game. And then currently with Kai Navigator, it's a Pacific Island based game. And so we've made sure we've got a Pacifica consultant who can kind of make sure that we're using the right terms. I'm from the Pacific Islands myself. So, you know, just having that kind of knowledge and being able to put some of that into it, I think as I said, that kind of Kiwi feel, but then also understanding that we've got such a great melting pot of cultures in New Zealand and appealing to all of them and making sure that they also feel included. So the Pacifica element to us was really important with this game, and that how could we bring something in that is inclusive of kids who aren't necessarily born in New Zealand or have different, backgrounds and cultures, but it also includes the Kiwi kids and their friends and how they might relate to them. But I mean, in general, I found that a lot of the games on HEIHEI do a really good job of having that diversity factor across the board, not just cultural, but gender-wise as well. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Just riffing off what you said at the beginning about balancing education with entertainment, I think that's a really good conversation to have just about games in general. But maybe, Dan, is there any insight you can shed on what that right balance is for people submitting projects to New Zealand On Air? Like how much education versus entertainment, or is there any kind of advice you can share on that line and how people walk across it?
Well, I've worked in games and education for the last decade, so it's a space I feel reasonably confident and comfortable talking about. One of the words, or some advice I always share with educators is don't try and make a game without a game designer, and to game designers, don't try and make a educational game without an educator. Otherwise, you kind of left somewhere in the middle, flip-flopping around, and it doesn't kind of achieve either of its goals as good as it could if that collaboration were to happen. But I would say games don't make didactic games. It's sort of like a good designed game shouldn't feel like an educational piece of content. It shouldn't feel like chocolate-coated broccoli.
Yeah, that's really valuable info. Do you have any perspective from New Zealand On Air's side on a preference that they have? Like if someone was to submit a purely entertainment game, or even a game that doesn't touch too heavily on the New Zealand culture versus a game that's 100% New Zealand orientated and fully educational, what perspective can you shed on what that submission process is like?
Well, NZ On Air have their own success criteria, and I think proposals, whether educational or edutainment or pure edutainment, they need to be good proposals first and foremost. And I don't think it's that black or white, I guess is what I'm thinking, Carl. Mm-hmm. My understanding is that proposals will come in and a team of assessors will look at those, and those will be weighed on the quality of the proposal that comes in through the door. Like, I think the people in NZ On Air that I know, care about education, they care about diversity, they care about a lot of stuff, like that, as I do, and as somebody who's been on the panels before. So
you actually bring up an interesting topic that I think is worth us focusing some time on, and that's the topic of proposals, because we're discussing the output of what the funding has produced, but there's actually a lot of skills in putting a proposal together before a game is developed, and I'd love to get some advice from some of the panelists on what that proposal process looked like, how much time you maybe spent on your proposals, and like any tidbit of information that those listening or those that are submitting for the very first time might be valuable in understanding that you maybe learned through the first couple times submitting that you weren't successful.
I'm happy to have a crack at that. We're originally a TV production company, so we've done about 28 to 30 funded TV series as well of all different types. So proposals is our game, and when I first started out, I had no idea what I was doing or what a proposal looked like. I just followed the sort of criteria that was set in terms of the request for proposals from New Zealand on air or for Te Mangai Paho. It wasn't until about 3 or 4 years later I finally got my hands on some other people's proposals, and realized how bad mine were. And so it's a really hard thing to do really well. And as Dan was rightly sort of saying, that the quality of that proposal is a key to getting funded. And so, you're asking in some cases, in the case probably for 50K worth of funding for a game, or thereabouts. So the importance of that proposal is really needs to be really strong. So I can't sort of say that how important that proposal is. My advice to people starting out is to go find someone who's done it before and ask them if they can see some of your old proposals. I'm quite happy to share those that we've done to other people, just to help them out and get them off the ground, because I'm really interested in people coming into this area. I'm not protective about our stuff at all. And so I'm quite happy to share what we've done, but what we've done may not be the best proposals either. There'll probably be better ones out there, And so, yeah, I think it's a really important part and something that's hard to get right and hard to learn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would love that to be I would love to just ask you all to share your proposals if you're interested, and I can push that through the NZGDA channels for those that might be interested during the application process. But don't feel obliged to. But maybe after this, I'll message everyone and see if I can pull that together. Any other advice from others about the proposal process?
Oh, I have a little crack at it. Both my New Zealand on air proposals, I don't think were very good. They were done in a very short space of time, last minute decisions. But I suppose I've done other proposals in my life, and I think there are a couple of key things, I suppose. One is just to make sure that the vision that you have, I suppose it's important to have a vision to begin with, but that you communicate the vision clearly. And that can sort of be through, artwork and things, or really well written, delivered kind of points. But that's really the key thing, is trying to convince people, often maybe who aren't in the game sphere, that this is an idea that New Zealand INEA will want to latch onto. And the remit, of course, is helping to produce New Zealand content. And no one knows what the limits of that is. I mean, Sam, you were talking about, how New Zealand games have kind of emerged, and there's this thing now and lots of diversity, but we still don't know where that can go. Like, I think it can be so many things that we haven't seen yet. And I guess you just have to find a way to convince whoever's assessing the panel that your idea ticks that box. Yeah, I would say, and you can go and read the New Zealand on air sort of guidelines. Like, they have bullet lists about what it is that they want to fund, and you can sort of let that guide you.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit more, Carl, and I think the last point, Steph, you made, there's always guidance around this. I always find that's a really good place to start, and being really clear and actually just hitting up some of your slides with literally the same headlines that has been asked for, just to make it really clear for the panelists. I think sometimes in trying to be creative, you put in other bits in there, but actually at the end of the day, those are the main things that they want to know. And sometimes the panel is made up of a whole lot of different people who might not be in the game space. So they want to understand exactly what it is you're delivering. And I just wrote down kind of 4 key words that now I might have to hold for when I do the next proposal. But I was thinking that passion is a really good one to make clear, but then also don't overdo it. I think a lot, sometimes you can kind of get go into pages and pages of trying to explain your game, and you don't necessarily need to do that. So just high level, what the passion coming through, which is what is the game, the creative around it. Being really functional with some of the proposal as well. And so things like your budget, your production timeline, the mechanics, like the target audience, those are real functional aspects of putting together, where you have to kind of think of the business side. So I think those are really important. And then I've also got like visualize. If someone was sitting there reading your proposal, how can you help the pictures form of what your games look like, your game looks like? So we put together mood boards that go with it. That isn't stuff that we've created for this particular game, but really good references that we found of the style that we might want to do. And here's some gameplay reference. So people can then start to think, oh, you're talking about a pinball game, and this is the style of art that you're going to use, and this is how it's going to play. They start to form a picture of how your game's going to look and feel, And then finally, I think the expertise coming through, which is your team. What's your experience? How have you done this? What have you done before? And so just making sure you're kind of ticking all of those boxes is really important. And it doesn't need to be long. You know, this isn't like a 20-page proposal. Remember that the panel's probably seen like, I don't know how many were submitted last time, maybe 60 or something, you know, there's a lot of those going through. So you want to try and get them hooked in basically with the first few pages.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. And just staying on you, I think you've done an amazing job at creating talent and creating jobs, and that's definitely saying that the New Zealand On Air that is in their criteria that they want to support. And I also am curious about your relationship with investors as well as applying for funding like this. And so I guess my question is, how has your process with New Zealand On Air evolved with your process of seeking investment elsewhere throughout your journey? And if there's any stories you can tell about how they've been interwoven with each other.
Yeah, and just on your point about creating talent, it's probably because we now have 3 studios. lots of people we need. But look, I don't know if it necessarily has. I guess the thing is that, you know, with the HEIHEI projects that we've done, it's helped show more expertise on our side, you know. So Mad Carnival is kind of a spin-off out of Method that launched early last year, and we were able to show, because we essentially took a small team out of Method and kind of incubated it out. So for us, it was the ability to show some of the work that we've been doing, and so the HEIHEI work really helped with that. We were actually working with a large platform on a game, and that really helped us kind of cement that, was sort of that experience and showing that specifically. And then I guess in terms of investment, again, it's just showing the experience that we have. You know, I've been doing this for a little while in terms of in the creative tech space, so I guess all those years probably helped as well. But just also in that we've delivered successful projects consistently is probably really helpful for us, which may not necessarily be the case for everyone listening on this. And I guess everyone has to start somewhere. Like our first one that we pitched, we weren't sure, I think we actually pitched 2 ideas, and so one got through. And I think, just because there have been certain ideas done before and you're like, oh, well, maybe we'll follow the same formula. I think differently. Like what is something that you really want to create, but how can you make a great game out of it? And look, one other thing I just add to that kind of proposal mix is I think in the last one, I might have even got some quotes from my son and his friends about how much they'd want to play this game that we'd written about. So, getting kids along in that process, I think is really helpful. Yeah,
that's great advice. And like whatever creative way that might set you apart from other proposals is always a good strategy, is how can you set yourself apart so that you're memorable. You mentioned the incubator of how Mad Carnival kind of came off Method, and you made me think of Black Salt Games coming out of Cerebral Fix and how they've just launched Dredge last week to some amazing global success. And it's a really interesting topic when we're talking about New Zealand On Air now, but you're also having some incredible global successes that are being developed here, and what that relationship could be with funding options like New Zealand On Air. I just wanted to make that comparison because there's lots of opportunities in the industry right now that if with the right angle, it could, you could have New Zealand On Air featured on some of these massive projects.
I mean, it's a good way, what I was saying earlier about the pinball game, is if you did think longer term and you're like, how do we start? I mean, this is a really good way of getting a prototype funded, essentially, because you've got a smaller audience. You don't have to do a full level, all the gameplay levels, and just do it like a slice of a game and deliver that through here. And I think it's a great way of up and coming studios to kind of have a go, see how that works with that audience, and then how that might translate into a larger, longer term game.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's a really interesting observation about how, the funding that's offered is really key for that prototyping or proof of concept phase. but not necessarily that full-fledged game concept that might be like a full experience. And one question I do have for you, Stef, is I know that you've received funding from Code in Dunedin, and I'd love to know what your relationship with that funding has been like compared to your funding that you've received from New Zealand On Air, in terms of what you've been able to achieve and what differences there have been between the two.
Yeah, of course. Well, just to be clear, like we were just starting out really, and we got some funding from Code, who maybe many people will know here, funding body based in Dunedin, who are now nationalising, and it was actually Code who encouraged us to apply for the New Zealand On Air funding.
Wow.
So here's a great opportunity, get experience, learn some things, put a game out, that this is perfect for you, which is great, and I think Code is really an economic economic development fund. They're kind of trying to boost the economy, the games industry. And New Zealand On Air has a slightly different remit, I think. They're trying to help content, New Zealand content kind of rise above the massive waves of American and whatever culture that we consume here. And I think they're very compatible, and I think, for example, like we have a Code project that we're working on. It's a very big project, and yet out of this came our Animal Tracks game for HEIHEI, which now we're developing further, kind of like you were saying, Sam, we're developing into a sort of a larger game to pitch to publishers in Germany later in the year, which would be great also to have New Zealand On Air on board with. But as it stands, we've had them kind of, they paid us to create the New Zealand version, which is up on HEIHEI now. I don't know. Yeah, I think a lot of funding schemes can be very compatible in that way, and that their goals don't conflict.
Yeah, that's
Bradley
great.
probably has stuff to say about this as well, right? Because you've had co-funding situations for your games.
Yeah, not so much co-funding, but alternative funding. So we've got 2 games that we've got funded through Te Mangai Paho. As our first game I mentioned was with Maru from Metia, and they produced that game for us. The second game that we did was Taniwha, which was a app game, and did really well from an awards point of view. So yeah, we were happy with that game. But the last that game funding was quite a whole lot more than what we get from New Zealand On Air for a web-based game. I think the budget for that was 187,000 for Taniwha. And yeah, we're really appreciative of that level of funding, because it allowed us to do something a little bit different, a little bit more. So yeah, I think both New Zealand On Air and Te Mangai Paho are challenged in that they have some criteria that they try to meet in terms of their broadcasting initiatives and what their charter says. And gaming doesn't sort of fit as well in that space to what they've traditionally done in the past. And yet my belief is that the gaming industry is potentially more important in terms of funding than even some of the other areas, and could return more to New Zealand in terms of return on investment. So yeah, and it's an interesting space in terms of funding levels.
Yeah, thanks for that. Just throwing over to you, Dan, just because I don't know too much of the inner workings of New Zealand On Air, but are there any discussions happening internally, or any insights that you'd like to share just about just from the perspective of New Zealand On Air that might be valuable to those applying in this next funding round?
I think what Brad just said is really important for people to understand. NZ On Air are working with the tools that they have as well. But to sort of answer your question, this year, this funding round specifically, there are some changes and some shifts for games. So previously it's always been targeting 5 to 9 year olds, but this round that's opening up a bit more, so to 10 to 12 year olds plus 13 to 14 year olds. The platform has historically for games always been HEIHEI. Going forward, this platform could be itch.io, It could be Steam, or it could be another industry platform. But what's important to say about that is, well, yeah, you need a platform. The game you're making has to live somewhere, and in your proposal, you need to sort of reassure the assessors how you'll be using your chosen platform to access the demographic and get eyeballs. Which leads us to marketing budgets. I think this is also a new ground for game studios applying for NZGDA funding. I think you'll be able to include in your proposal some lines for marketing your game as well. I don't know exactly what that looks like just yet, but hopefully that's something Kelly can help us with afterwards. Yeah, the other big kind of shifts that I'm comfortable talking about.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think that's incredibly insightful. Just that demographic range, I think, opens up a lot of opportunities and ideas that people listening might want to lean into. I guess just opening up the floor, we've only got a few more minutes left, and then I want to maybe just hear a couple words from Kelly, and then maybe a Q&A if there's some people in the call that might want to have any specific questions maybe directed at Kelly or Dan or any of the panelists as well. Before we do that, I just want to open the floor to the panelists if there's any kind of pieces, like stories about New Zealand on Air that you think are worth mentioning from your journey, that could be worth just us hearing about in this chance to capture all New Zealand on Air related discussions for games. Is there anything interesting that you've come across that you'd like to share?
I know I've talked a lot. I just really want to say, I don't think I communicated enough what the experience has been like for us, but generally it has been a really great way to get experience, learn a lot about sort of production and scope in a very, very low risk way. So, you know, the production's paid for basically if you're very careful. It's been great for sort of adding games to our roster without having to work too hard to sell them afterwards to recoup money. As a small kind of startup studio, New Zealand, did I say New Zealand? New Zealand on Air has been great for us. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, is that even if you're listening to this and you're an indie dev or you're fresh out of uni, that just applying and just going through that process is such a great learning experience when you have to just ask yourself, you know, what is going to be the marketing budget for this, and asking yourself these questions, even if you don't feel like you're ready or the skills aren't there yet, or if you don't have that clear vision yet. Just trying to put something together, if you know that that's eventually something you'd love to do in your career, or eventually build a studio, then practicing on these funding rounds, I think, is a great opportunity to learn lessons, and network, reach out to others that you've seen have successfully been funded, maybe exactly like Bradley said, finding proposals of people that have successfully been funded and seeing if they're open to sharing. Going and submitting a proposal just triggers a bunch of neurons in the brain that will help you level up, no pun intended, for future proposals that you might succeed. Actually, that's one question I do want to ask, maybe a final question to the panelists. And have you had any failed proposals in your time? And you could just answer with yes or no, or you can go into more detail about those failures, and if you understand why they failed. I think that's a good topic for us to end on, just because obviously all of you have succeeded, but I do think failure is part of the process. So I'd love to hear from each. We'll go through each one at a time, starting with you, Stef.
Both of our proposals were successful, so no failures yet.
Cool, thank you. And Sam?
Before I talk about the failures, which will be really quick, but I just wanted to kind of say that I think one of the things with creating this sort of content is to remember that we're creating content for Tamarikihi and Aotearoa. So I think that's really, really important. And I know some of the bigger game studios don't look at these funds because they aren't big, you know. But the idea that you're creating content that's so specific to Kiwi kids, I think, is just so important. And I'd love to, you know, for us to continue doing that whenever as much as we can. We've also not had a failed proposal so far, so we've been really, really lucky. But throughout my 20-something years, we've had a lot of failed pitches and proposals, and you just move on to the next one. I feel like we've got an ideas shelf, you know, a literal idea shelf of thing, and you always think, oh, that's a shame that one didn't happen, but you'll have another one, and another one will come across, and that one might be the one that gets through. So I reckon all of it's just great experience, you know.
Definitely. Bradley, over to you.
Yeah, I think we've had one failure in New Zealand Air funding rounds, but we've had other failures for games with Te Mangai Paho and elsewhere. But yeah, the failures are really just one person or a group of people's opinions, in my view of it, you know. So keep working hard and developing. I mean, when we look at our TV side, one of our comedies took us 7 times to get to production, you know, and that was just a pilot of the series. So, and then it never went to full production, even though the pilot was well received. So you get all these kind of things happening in the industry, both in the TV and in the gaming world. But just keep trying, keep working hard, trying to work out how to get around it is the key. And it is rewarding doing those proposals. It is rewarding making the games. As Sam said, you know, making games for Kiwi kids is really rewarding. And to see the joy that you get from watching people play those games is really cool too.
Thanks, Bradley. And Dan.
Yeah, we were successful in the first funding round for HEIHEI. Then we were not successful for 2 years, and then that came down to the quality of our proposal. Actually, I remember having a coffee afterwards, sort of, and this is important as well. If you don't get funding, maybe ask why not, you know, and ask for feedback. And so I checked in to see what was wrong with our proposal, and I failed to articulate a couple of things properly, which caused confusion on the panel. And so that was really good to know. Future proposals have been successful, and I make it a priority to test our proposals out with other people who have read lots of proposals before. Yeah, and I've also seen proposals come in, fail, and then get resubmitted and succeed. So again, keep trying.
Yeah, that's really great advice from everyone. And I just really appreciate the humility and openness that everyone's had, because it's not fun or positive to talk about failures, but I think it goes such a long way in terms of being motivational and inspiring to those just starting out. So thank you so much for being open about that. I would like to see if Kelly wants to say a few words, maybe any observations that she's made, or any just any kind of pointers about the funding round that's about to happen that could be valuable to those listening.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. It's been really, really interesting listening to the discussion and recognising many of the games that we funded that you've all created and how well they've done. It's also really interesting hearing what people's kind of concerns and questions are about New Zealand On Air, how we fund games and what we do, what our remit is. So I've really enjoyed hearing all of that. There was a question that came up in your discussion that I could address, which was around the balance between if a game is very New Zealand and very educational and the implication was a bit boring, versus something that was very broad in its scope and highly entertaining. And I think it was a pretty, those are, you know, that's very black and white, and nothing ever really is. But it's probably worth pointing out that New Zealand On Air's remit, as I'm sure everybody is aware, is around reflecting New Zealand to New Zealanders. So that it's through that kind of lens that we assess everything that we fund. So in games, you might think about, is this something that is intrinsically Kiwi, and in what way? But on the other side, we are not like partly to fund something that is very boring, or too much broccoli, not enough chocolate, to pick up on what Dan said. One of the prisms that we put everything that we fund through is this question of, would it be funded by somebody else if we were not to support this? And so if a game or a TV show or a piece of music would be able to be made by funding that they could source elsewhere because it is so commercial in nature, for example, then that wouldn't be a high priority for public media funding, which is us. So would this get made without our support is a really big question that we ask. But we have a very, very, very strong focus on reaching audiences and on quality. So if you've got a concept for something that is, entirely New Zealand in nature, but no kid engages with it, that would not score highly with us either.
Thank you, Kelly. We probably have time for 1 or 2 questions from any of the listeners. So if you want to please either raise your hand and I'll throw it over to you, or if you want to put it in the chat, whether you want to ask Kelly or any of the panelists, go for it. Oh, we've had a few come through. Okay, great. How do you market to kids? Do you target their parents? Asks Trent. Who would like to answer that? Maybe Kelly or Dan or any of the panelists?
Well, I think the Ministry of Education have a platform called Get Into Gaming. And so if you were to submit a proposal that where the platform was to be Get Into Gaming, you could argue that the Ministry of Education is going to be putting that platform in front of lots of kids' eyeballs. That's one way. But then there's other traditional forms of marketing as well, which I'm not so qualified to speak of.
Yep, definitely. I'm just reading through this next comment. So I'm just going to read the question part. I'll just read the whole thing. I find it interesting that the games funding through New Zealand On Air seems only targeted at a young audience. Are there any options for projects that are not in this vein? Can they fall under other categories such as scripted? Does this also speak a bit to how games are still seen as a product for children here, as opposed to a medium for expression, just like film, TV, or music? Lots of thumbs up on that.
So I'd really like to answer that because it's not at all because games are seen by New Zealand On Air as a children's thing or undervalued in that way. I mean, we know that 90% of New Zealanders play games regularly, so it's an incredibly important medium. But one thing that's probably really important to know is that New Zealand On Air as a crown entity operates under legislation. That legislation that we operate under is from 1989 when New Zealand On Air was established, and it hasn't been changed. And so we have certain criteria that we operate under that are no longer quite right for the media environment in which we currently live. And one of those is around platforms. So in 1989, everybody was watching linear television. And so the way that it works is you go and you have your wonderful idea, you pitch it to a platform, the platform says, yes, we will support that if New Zealand On Air will fund it. You then propose that to New Zealand On Air during one of our funding rounds and the assessment process begins. So in a world where we have games, but there isn't a New Zealand-based platform to host those games, we have a bit of a problem. So the HEIHEI platform has been brilliant because it is New Zealand and it has enabled us to support the production of games that can be based on that, and that gets us around that platform issue. So that is why historically our games have been targeted at younger audiences. It's for that platform issue. Anything that's funded by New Zealand On Air needs to have a New Zealand platform associated with it. And you'll see in this particular round, we have tried to open that up. So we are welcoming applications that are not just for HEIHEI games, but we are in a constant process with everything that we fund of trying to work with the limits of an act that is no longer reflective of the world that we live in.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for that context. That's really valuable to hear. And it's exciting to hear that you're doing as much as you can to help open that up a little bit. And because of that, I'm really excited to see the kind of projects that get funded in this next round and how that continues the conversation. So thank you, and thank you for everything that you're doing to help advocate for games and on different platforms and things like that. Thank you. Next question, and we are running very short on time, so keep them coming through, but I might need to just cut it off. Unfortunately, I don't want to go too much over. Next question. You discussed about how platforms opened up this funding round, and in future, are tabletop RPG or board games applicable? These are trending in gaming spaces again. So are you able to propose a board game or a tabletop RPG game for this New Zealand On Air funding round?
Sadly, no. And the other 100 games I particularly enjoy as well. But our remit is very much around screen-based media environment. So no.
Awesome. No, thanks for that context. And yeah, digital, the word digital I think is important there. But I do think that's an interesting conversation in the just broader game space as well, for just representation of New Zealand-based board games as well.
Yes.
Great. Just going through, how long was the development time for the games that you got funded? Stef answered both our games took about 6 months to develop, a little too long. Sam says 5 to 6 months to us. And then,
5 to 6 months.
yeah, 5 to 6 months as well. Okay, it seems like a trend. Awesome. And then we've got question from Ed asking, the question is you were declined, but if you'd like to frame that in a question to one of the people, more than happy to ask that.
I've read that question. I can sort of answer it in some ways.
Thank you.
We've done 4 games, and all of our games have a Māori language component to that game. So just because you've got a game idea that has a Māori language component or a Māori cultural component doesn't mean that you're getting rejected for that, for sure. Because all 4 of our games had that. So yeah, it's, once again, it just comes down to the quality of proposals, the quality of the team, all those things that Sam talked about. Would be probably part of that assessment, and it would be worthwhile following up next time or this time on what feedback you can get about any feedback you can get about your proposal and why it may have been declined, because they may have some more specific areas to cover.
Yeah, I'm happy to add to that. Thank you, Bradley. That's exactly right. But also, what we have to take other criteria into account, such as repetition or duplication. So it could be that your project is declined because there's something very similar we've just funded that's in production, or that you're not aware of that's already out in the world. It's really, really worth asking for a chat to get that feedback from us about why it was declined. We are currently in the unfortunate situation of declining more applications than we are able to approve for funding. So sometimes an application will be excellent, but we are just not able to have enough money in that funding round to for it to make the cut. And so if you learn that about your project, you might be able to retool it and bring it into another round and be successful. The track record that you can point to in games creation and the success that you can point to in reaching the audience that the RFP is trying to reach are also criteria that you want to make sure you're hitting in order to be successful. But yeah, it's audiences that are harder to reach, or targeted audiences, Māori audiences, they're all priorities for us. So projects that meet those audiences really well tend to do better than ones that don't. So we certainly wouldn't, that would not be a reason for decline ever. It would be something else.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for your time and for jumping at the end. Thank you so much to the panelists for providing your time and your stories and your advice, and also your suggestions. I think it's been a really, really valuable and productive conversation all around. I'm going to close with a karakia. If you want to listen to this again, it's going to go up onto our YouTube channel in the coming weeks if you want to listen back. But at the end of the day, thank you so much, everyone, for joining, especially engaging in this live webinar and spending your last hour with us. So, unahia, unahia, unahia ki te uru tapu nui, kia watea, kia mama, te nakau, te tinana, te wirau, e te atara, te takata, koia te irongo, whakairia, ake ki runga, kia tina, huie, takie. Thank you everyone for putting up with me while I'm learning my karakias. Thank you so much for your time and listening in. Hope you all have a great evening. Thank you so much and have a great night.
Ka kite.
Take care. Thank you.